Wyoming Territory, late summer of 1879. The sun was high, the wind dry as bone, and the girl in the canyon was about to die. Rhetta Mae Morgan had wandered off the main trail trying to find her sketchbook, which had slipped from her saddlebag during a rest stop. She had not meant to go far, just enough to glance around the bend and check the ridge. But now, standing frozen in a dusty ravine, her boots rooted in panic, she realized her mistake. 5 rattlesnakes coiled around her in a loose ring, their bodies twitching, tongues flicking. One had already uncurled halfway toward her left foot. She dared not move. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears, louder than the wind. Then came the sound of hooves fast, heavy, closing in. A cowboy burst into view, his horse skidding to a halt on a narrow ledge above the ravine. He was tall, sunburned, and broad through the shoulders, with a rifle already drawn and steady in his hands. His voice rang clear. "Do not move." Rhetta did not blink. The man took aim and fired once, twice, 3 times. Not a bullet missed. The snakes dropped, writhing, then stilled. Dust floated in the air like smoke. He slid down from his saddle without hesitation, his boots crunching softly as he stepped into the shallow gully. She watched him approach, her breath caught in her throat. "You hurt?" he asked, his rifle lowering. Rhetta shook her head. "No." Just her voice trembled. "I could not move." He nodded once. "You did right." Then he offered his hand. She hesitated for just a second before placing her fingers in his. His grip was warm, steady. He led her carefully over the last snake, his free hand resting lightly at her back. "What were you doing down here alone?" he asked, lifting her effortlessly onto his horse. "My sketchbook blew off," she said, flushed and unsteady. "I thought I could find it." He swung up behind her without pause, the horse shifting under their weight. "You almost traded a book for your life," he said, not unkindly. She turned her face partially over her shoulder. "Thank you." He nodded again, looking out across the canyon. "Name is Thayer Abbott." "Rhetta Morgan." They rode in silence for a few breaths. She felt the press of his chest behind her, solid and certain. His hand rested lightly at her side to keep her steady. The fear still lingered in her bones, but it was fading now. "How far's your camp?" he asked. "About 2 miles south. I was with a group heading toward Laramie." He guided the horse with one hand, the other never letting her slip. "I'll take you there." They reached the small wagon group before the sun dipped too far, and Rhetta slid down from the horse with shaky legs. Her aunt rushed to her, fussing, but Rhetta's eyes found Thayer again as he dismounted. He spoke with her uncle briefly, then turned back to her. "I'll leave you to rest. You need anything? I'm working fence over at Willow Creek for the next 3 weeks." She nodded. "I remember. Thank you again." He gave her a slight tilt of his hat, then mounted and turned his horse, riding off into the golden light. That night, Rhetta could not sleep. She kept seeing him, shoulders squared, rifle steady, walking right into danger like it was nothing. And the way he had held her, not with ownership, but with care. That quiet strength. She had never felt anything like it. By morning, she was packing her things. "I am going back to thank him properly," she told her aunt. Her uncle tried to protest, but gave in when he saw the look in her eye. "Take the mare. Be back by Sunday." Rhetta rode alone, following the path Thayer had taken. She reached Willow Creek by dusk the next day. The ranch was modest but well kept, a cabin, a corral, and a stretch of open land dotted with stakes and new rail. She spotted him near the barn, shirt sleeves rolled, hammer in hand. He looked up at the sound of hooves. When Thayer saw her, his whole posture shifted. He stood straighter, his jaw tightening just a little. "You all right?" he asked. "I am." He walked to her, hand out to help her down. Something happen? I came to say thank you, she said, her eyes meeting his. For what you did. He nodded, but something in his gaze lingered. You already said it. I wanted to say it again, in person, without snakes around. That pulled a small grin from him. Well, I appreciate that. She hesitated. You live out here alone? He looked toward the cabin. I do. Keeps things simple. I would not mind simple, she said. Thayer looked at her. Really looked, and his expression shifted something quiet, something warming. Did you ride all this way just to thank me, Miss Morgan? I rode all this way because I could not stop thinking about you. He stepped a little closer. Is that so? Yes. They stood in silence, the sun bleeding into the hills behind them. Then Thayer reached out and brushed a bit of dust from her sleeve. His fingers were rough, careful. You want supper? He asked. She smiled. I do. He led her toward the cabin, the door swinging open behind them, wood creaking under their boots. Rhetta felt something new settle in her chest. Not fear, not panic. Something like the start of belonging. The cabin was quiet save for the low crackle of the cook stove and the soft clink of enamelware as Rhetta set 2 bowls down on the table. Thayer had brought in a brace of quail earlier, and she'd insisted on helping prepare them. She hadn't said much during the plucking, but her hands had worked fast and sure. He noticed that, as they ate, the windows caught the last of the light. Outside, the land stretched open and unbothered. Inside, the space between them felt still but not empty. Rhetta took a bite, then glanced at him. You built this place yourself? Mostly, Thayer said. Started with a wagon bed and a lean-to. Added on when I had time and wood enough. She traced the rim of her bowl with a fingertip. It's solid. You've made it feel finished. He looked at her, then at the floorboards beneath their boots. Still a few things I'd like to do. Replace the roof slats before the snows come. Maybe dig a root cellar. You'll need someone to help with that. He paused, not sure if she meant it the way it sounded, but her eyes didn't move from his. You know your way around a shovel? He asked. My father ran a mill in Missouri. I've lifted flour sacks heavier than a fence rail. Thayer leaned back slightly. That's so. I don't like being idle, she said. Never have. He nodded once, slowly. You come west looking for something? She set her spoon down and folded her hands. I came west because I'd spent the last 3 years drawing things that didn't mean anything to me. Streets, buildings, people in hats they didn't like wearing. I thought if I came here, maybe I'd find something worth holding on to. Thayer studied her face. You find it? Not yet, but I'm closer than I was. He didn't reply, but the look in his eyes changed a quiet shift, like the first wind before a storm. Not threatening, just certain. Rhetta stood and carried her bowl to the basin, rinsing it with water she'd drawn from the pump earlier. When she turned, he was still sitting, but his gaze hadn't wavered. You get lonely out here? She asked. Some. Comes and goes. She leaned against the edge of the counter. I think I could stand this kind of quiet, if I had reason. Thayer rose, slow and deliberate. He crossed the room, stopping just short of her hand. You don't strike me as someone who stays put long, he said. You don't know me well enough to say that. I'd like to. Rhetta didn't move away. Then ask. His voice was low. What did you leave behind in Missouri? She hesitated. A man who cared more for his name than for me, and a town that expected me to marry him because it was convenient. His jaw twitched once, barely noticeable. You're not someone built for convenience. No, she said. I'm not. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing the shutters. He reached for her hand, then not sudden, not hesitant, just steady. Her fingers curled into his without thought. I meant to bring your sketchbook, he said. I kept it. Pages got a little bent, but it's all there. She blinked once, surprised. You found it. Near the ridge where I spotted the snakes. Figured it mattered. It does. He let go of her hand long enough to retrieve it from a shelf near his cot. When he handed it over, she opened it gently, flipping past worn corners and faint smudges. She paused at a page, a half-finished drawing of a long valley, the lines careful, searching. I never finished this one, she said. You still can. She looked up at him. I'd need the right place. Thayer didn't smile, but he didn't look away. I'll build the cellar, he said. You can pick where it goes. Rhetta stepped closer, the sketchbook still in her hands. And if I stayed? His voice was even. I wouldn't ask you to, but I'd want you to. She set the book down on the table, then reached up and touched his chest, just above where his heart beat steady beneath his shirt. I already decided, she said. He bent his head, slow and sure, and pressed his forehead to hers. The silence between them was full now, not empty, not waiting, just full. They stood like that until the fire burned down and the only light left was the soft glow of coals and the steady promise of morning. And neither of them felt alone. The first frost came early that year. It crusted the scrub grass and turned the creek banks brittle, and the mornings began with the smell of wood smoke and the sound of water stiffening in the pail. Thayer rose before dawn, as he always did, but now there were 2 mugs warming on the stove ledge instead of 1. Rhetta was already at the table, her sleeves rolled, sorting through a pile of seed catalogs an old trapper had traded for flour and lard the week before. Her hair was tied back with a scrap of muslin, and her thumb bore a faint ink stain from the night before. You planning a spring garden? Thayer asked, pouring the coffee. Something small, she said, not looking up. Beans, onions. Maybe squash if the soil's decent. He handed her the mug and sat across from her. This ground's hard-packed. You'll have to break it deep. I know. I marked a patch near the back fence. Gets good light. He nodded and took a sip. That where you want the well? Rhetta set down the catalog. You dig that before winter? If you're staying, he said, watching her over the rim of his cup. I want it in before the ground freezes solid. She didn't answer right away. Her gaze drifted to the window, where the sun was just beginning to lift a thin gold line over the ridge. I wrote my aunt, she said quietly. Told her I won't be making it back by Christmas. Thayer didn't move. The stove ticked as the heat settled. She'll worry, he said. She'll understand. Rhetta stood and walked to the door, opening it to the sharp morning air. She leaned on the frame and stared out at the fence line, where a new heifer had started nosing around the posts. I've been thinking about the ridge, she said. Where you found me. I want to climb it. That ridge is steep and shale-backed. I can manage. Thayer stood, pulled on his coat, and stepped outside beside her. You going up alone? She glanced at him. I'd rather not. They saddled the horses and rode out without another word. The wind carried the scent of pine and cold grass, and the world was still, save for the steady rhythm of hooves on the hard ground. The ridge rose ahead, a long spine of rock and sage that cut against the sky. When they reached the base, they dismounted and tied the horses in a thicket of rabbit brush. Rhetta led the way, her boots finding footholds with quiet determination. She didn't speak until they reached the top. Here, she said, stopping beside a flat boulder. This is where I dropped it. Thayer stood beside her, hands in his coat pockets. You sure? I remember the wind kicked up from the south. It took the pages right out of my lap. She crouched, brushing her fingers across the rock. I thought I might sketch it again. From here. You bring paper? No. Just wanted to see it first. The view stretched wide, the canyon below, the scrublands beyond, and, farther still, the faint line of smoke from their chimney. "I thought I'd die here," she said, her voice quiet. "Not from the snakes, exactly. From the fear. Like I couldn't move, and that would be it." Thayer didn't answer. He just stood beside her, his presence steady. "Then you rode in," she said. "And everything changed." She looked over at him. "Why'd you come that way? Could have taken the road to Laramie. Fence markers were rotted out. I went to check the alignment. Wasn't planning to ride the canyon." Rhetta straightened. "So it wasn't luck." "I don't believe in luck," he said. "Not the kind that saves people." She turned toward him, the wind tugging at the hem of her coat. "What do you believe in?" He met her eyes. "Work. Quiet. Doing what's right, even if no one sees it." She studied him a long moment. "You always this steady?" "No," he said. "Not until you." She stepped toward him, close enough to feel his breath. "I don't know what this is yet," she said. "But I know it's not something I want to leave behind." "You don't have to know everything," he said. "Just what you want." "I want a place that's mine. A life I choose. Someone who sees me clear and doesn't flinch." His hands, calloused and sure, touched her waist. "Then stay." She leaned in, resting her forehead against his chest. "I already did." They stood on the ridge, the land silent around them, the wind curling past like a living thing. Below, the world went on, unknowing and unchanged. But between them, something had rooted itself deep and strong. When they rode back down, the sun was higher, and their horses moved in quiet rhythm side by side. Neither spoke, but the silence between them had shifted. It held something new now, a promise, unspoken, but sure as the land beneath their boots. The wind had shifted by late October, rolling down from the mountains with a sharper bite. The horses grew restless in the mornings, their breath showing in thick puffs, and the chickens lingered longer in the coop. Rhetta pulled her shawl tighter as she hung the last of the washed linens on the line, her fingers stiff from the cold. Thayer was hammering up new shutters on the cabin's west side, where the storms came hardest. He paused only when he heard her call. "There's a leak under the loft eave. Water's been dripping into the grain sack." He set the hammer down. "I'll see to it before sundown." Rhetta nodded and turned back to the line, clothespins clenched between her lips. The quiet between them these days had taken on a kind of rhythm, not silence, but an ease that filled the space without needing to be named. That afternoon, Thayer hitched the wagon and they rode south toward the trading post. Supplies were thinning: salt, lamp oil, a new flint for the rifle, and winter didn't leave room for forgetting. The trail ran along the lower creek, where the willows had long since dropped their leaves and the ground crunched under wheel. Thayer glanced sideways at her as the horses trotted. "You ever ride in snow?" "Once," Rhetta said. "Back in Missouri. The river froze solid and we crossed it with a sleigh." "You miss it?" She didn't answer right away. "I miss who I was before people started telling me who I ought to be." He gave a short nod, eyes on the trail. "That version of you still here?" "I think she's quieter now," Rhetta said. "But not gone." The trading post was a squat stone building set beside a bend in the creek. A few other wagons were there, a family loading sacks of flour, and an older man brushing snow from a barrel of apples. Inside, the stove was already burning low, and the air smelled of tobacco and cedar. Thayer handled the trade 3 pelts and a sack of oats for the goods they needed, while Rhetta lingered near a shelf of sewing notions. Her fingers brushed over a length of dark calico, blue flowers scattered over black. The shopkeeper, a narrow man with a white beard, caught her eye. "Good for winter dresses. Where's warm?" She turned. "How much?" 2 eggs and a jar of preserves." She looked back at Thayer, who was tying the last of their items into the wagon. "I've got plum jelly at home." The man smiled faintly. "You bring it next trip." She folded the fabric carefully and tucked it under her arm. On the ride back, the sky darkened early, and the wind picked up along the ridgeline. Rhetta pulled her coat tighter around her and looked out over the edge of the hill trail. "You ever think about what comes next?" she asked. Thayer gave a quiet grunt. "You mean after winter? After this? After you and me?" He didn't answer for a while. Just let the horses pull the wagon steady along the slope. "I think about where to put the second room," he said finally. "If we plan to stay past spring, we'll need space." She turned toward him, watching his profile in the fading light. "You don't ask many questions." "Never saw the use in asking what a person'll tell you when they're ready." She smiled faintly. "And if they never are? Then I wait. Some things don't come easy." They reached the cabin just as night settled in. Thayer unhitched the team while Rhetta carried the fabric inside, smoothing it over the table with slow, thoughtful hands. Later, as the fire burned low, she sat beside him on the floor, her knees drawn up, her sketchbook resting on one thigh. She hadn't drawn the ridge yet, she didn't have the right lines in her head for it, but tonight, her pencil moved slow and certain. Thayer watched her for a while, then leaned back against the wall and shut his eyes. She didn't speak, but her hand drifted out and rested lightly on his boot. He didn't move, just settled deeper into the silence, the fire casting long gold shadows across the room. Outside, the wind howled low against the eaves, and the night deepened around them. But inside, the warmth held. The cellar was finished by the second week of November. Thayer laid the final planks over the hatch just as the sun slipped behind the pines, long shadows stretching over the dirt yard. Rhetta stood nearby with her hands tucked inside her shawl, watching the last of the light catch the edge of the new roof slats he'd added a few days earlier. "You've built every inch of this with your own hands," she said. He wiped the dirt from his palms on his trouser leg. "Didn't see much point waiting for someone else to do it." She stepped closer, her boots soft over the packed earth. "You ever want more than this?" Thayer leaned his weight against the post beside the doorway. "I used to think wanting more just made a man careless. Now I think it depends on what the more is." She looked up at him then, her expression unreadable in the dimming light. "I want to build something here, not just a life. A home, a place that holds." He didn't speak, but he reached over and ran a hand along the edge of her sleeve. That was answer enough. Inside, the fire was already going. Rhetta peeled off her outer shawl and reached for the bundle she'd hidden beneath the cot earlier that morning. She unfolded the calico she'd bartered for weeks ago, now stitched into a simple dress with long sleeves and a fitted bodice. She held it up between them. "I made this to wear on the day we decide," she said. Thayer crossed the room, his steps slow but certain. "Decide what?" "That you and I are not just waiting out the winter together." His gaze held hers. "You want a preacher? I want what's honest. If you'd rather speak vows with just the creek and the sky to hear, I'd take that." He nodded once. "I'd like to give you my name." She didn't move, but her eyes shone. "I'd like to take it." They stood in the cabin's quiet, the firelight soft on the walls. Thayer reached into the chest beside the hearth and pulled out a small parcel wrapped in oilcloth. He handed it to her without a word. Inside was a thin silver ring, plain but solid. "It was my mother's," he said. "She wore it till her hands gave out." Rhetta touched the band gently. "I'll wear it till mine do." They married 3 days later, beside the creek where the willows bowed low over the water. No preacher came, just the two of them, the cold air, and the hush of the land bearing witness. Thayer spoke only once. "I'll walk beside you as long as breath stays in me," she answered. "And I'll walk with you." That night, Rhetta lit the lamp and laid the folded dress over the cedar chest. Thayer stood at the table, pouring coffee into 2 tin cups. When he passed her one, she touched his hand and held it. "I never thought I'd find someone who'd read me without asking me to speak," she said. He looked at her over the rim of his cup. "You're easy to read when you're still," she smiled. "Then I'll try to stay still more often." "No," he said. "You stay just as you are." Winter came early, snow drifting in before the month's end. They kept each other warm with laughter, shared work, and the comfort of knowing the other would always be there when night fell. Rhetta sketched by the firelight, pages filling with the lines of their land, the bend of the creek, the slope of the ridge, the shape of the cabin from the east field. Thayer built a cradle from pine scraps when the year turned and the firewood pile dwindled, and Rhetta's hand found his more often, resting against her belly, where new life had begun to stir. By late spring, the garden was planted, the hens brooding, and the root cellar full. Rhetta stood in the doorway one morning with her hand on the frame, watching the wind move through the pasture. Thayer came up behind her, sliding his arms around her waist. "You've made this place different," he said. She leaned back into him. "We made it together." They stayed year after year, built a second room, then a third, planted apple trees and watched them take root. Their hands aged, but never slowed. Their hearts never turned from one another. And when their children grew tall and strong, they taught them how to listen to the land, to speak plainly, and to love with both hands open. They never needed more than what they'd built, because what they'd built held, and it always would.